Hello all, and the very warmest of welcomes to the True Crime Enthusiast podcast, the regular slice of true crime that may be unfamiliar to you, that I bring from my North Wales crime library, and that I have scoured the dark underbelly of the UK and occasionally worldwide to do so. Doing this is myself, Paul, the creator, host and true crime enthusiast of the show's title. My beloved true crime enthusiast cat, Peaksy, is here as per ever. And me and Peaksy are completed by yourselves, the wonderful enthusiasts that make my show so worthwhile and my absolute privilege to do. It means as ever the world having you join us today. I thank you very kindly for doing so, and hope that as you have, it's for an episode that finds you and yours all good, all safe, and all well. Right down to business here then, no messing about today, and for the tale this time around, we head back only a few years ago to 2012 and to the nearest English city to where I live, the cathedral city of Chester, right on the Wales-England border. Based on the River Dee, with a population of almost 90,000 people, it's the most populous settlement in the borough of Cheshire West and Chester, the historic county town, and after Warrington, the county's second largest settlement. Couple of stats about Chester, somewhere as I say I know very well. It's England's best preserved walled city and also home to the UK's oldest sporting venue that's still in continual use, as the Rudee, Chester's racecourse, has hosted horse racing since 1539. Notable people to hail from Chester include Diana Beck, the UK's first female neurosurgeon, who became notable not just for this, but for performing life-saving brain surgery upon Winnie the Pooh creator A.A. Milne in 1952, 70s and 80s comedian Russ Abbott, the band Manson, what a great album Attack of the Grey Lantern is too, and James Bond himself, but by no means the best Bond, actor Daniel Craig. My favourite things that I unearthed about Chester whilst researching is that the first person to walk across Chester's Grosvenor Bridge was a young then Princess Victoria, when the bridge was opened by her mother on October the 17th, 1832. I have heard before that many years ago, within the Chester city walls, there used to be a pub for every single day of the year, and that an ancient Tudor law dictated that Welshmen were not allowed within the city between sunset and sunrise, whilst another law dictated that it was legal to shoot a Welshman with a bow and arrow within Chester city walls after midnight. Now, reportedly, the former has long gone, and if it hasn't, then it's a law I've broken many bloody times throughout my life, but of the latter, there's no record of this law ever having been repealed, hence the reason, just in case mind, that I reserve going out on the lash to my home city of Wrexham, Chester's greatest rivals. Chester was the scene of a horrific crime back in 2012 that, like most murders in the UK, seems to have been born out of nothing, a momentary flash of seeing red, or from an argument stemming from a mistaken belief. But with this one, it was the actions of the sadistic killer that singles this crime out, for with it, he attempted to imitate what he saw as art with it, which I shall tell you all about right now. The episode contains details and descriptions of crimes and events, including descriptions of injury detail that some listeners may find disturbing and or distressing. So please use discretion whilst you're listening in all. With that in mind, please join the True Crime Enthusiast for an episode I've entitled A Homage to the Loved Ones. 53-year-old Chester resident Andrew Mackenzie Nall, known locally as Scottish Andy, was discovered horrifically murdered in the bedroom of his home, Flat 4 Eversley Park, just off Chester's Liverpool Road, at 8:15 p.m. on Friday the 31st of August 2012. A police-made video of the scene, shown to Chester Crown Court at criminal proceedings the following year, depicted Andrew's severely beaten and mutilated body, seen in the half-light of the flat, lying on the floor on his back, topless and with his jeans pulled down slightly, leaving his genitals exposed. Clear, shallow, parallel linear cuts were visible to the left side of his bloodied face, and, as the prosecution were to allege at the trial, there was a strange long wound carved into his abdomen and other wounds that looked as though someone had drawn in a bizarre way upon his body. Juxtaposed against such a horrific scene, the lid from an emptied Saxo salt container could be seen lying just above Andrew's head. It was only following the post-mortem, performed by Dr. Christopher Johnson of the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, that the true horror of Mr. Nall's death was revealed. Dr. Johnson found that he died of multiple injuries, with 18 or 19 stab wounds among a total of 49 separate knife wounds to his body. Dr. Johnson noted multiple long shallow wounds and marks to the left face, left arm and the front of the torso, which appeared to have been inflicted with knives, though scissors were recovered from the scene featuring Mr. Nall's blood and body tissue, which he conceded could have been used to cause some of the more superficial injuries. When the victim was dead or close to death, an unusual stab and puncture wounds to the right ankle. He noted several stab and slash injuries typically associated with a person trying to defend themselves, including 2 which had passed right through the upper left arm and wrist, and a total of 5 stab track injuries found to the heart, one of which had passed all the way through. There were complex ribcage injuries caused by both stab wounds and blunt force trauma, with at least 8 stab tracks passing through the left chest cavity and 3 to 4 cutting through bone, which would have required severe force. There were crush injuries to the right side of the chest with associated bruising, suggesting the damage was caused when the victim was still alive, and severe damage to the victim's voice box, which was likely due to strangulation. Dr. Johnson also found a cream-like substance in Mr. Nall's left eye, which was also found on the mirrored sliding door close to where the victim's head lay, and which was later found to be cleaning fluid. But perhaps most chillingly, the sadistic killer had carved a long curved hole into Mr. Nall's abdomen, and had then filled the gaping wound with salt. Mr. Nall's body was in fact covered in it, suggesting it had been thrown into his wounds, perhaps to inflict more pain and suffering upon him in his dying moments. Horror beyond belief, that, isn't it? Now, the resulting murder investigation, though it would take painstaking establishment of the victim's last known movements, wasn't to be a long drawn-out affair, for not only had the murder and almost ritualistic torture been witnessed by another person, but in fact, 3 hours before the discovery of Mr. Nall's body, police had already arrested his killer in connection with an unconnected matter, a serious assault that had occurred by the Fountains roundabout on Chester's Northgate Street in the city centre. Mr. Nall's killer, a then 41-year-old homeless substance user named Gary Anthony George, a man well known to the victim, had told police upon being arrested, "I've killed my best mate, but he's just paedophile guff. He deserved it." Mr. Nall was duly discovered by police following this admission, after they visited the address some 3 hours later as part of their investigation into the assault. As the scene was sealed off, Chester Outer Neighbourhood Policing Unit officers duly increased their presence in the Eversley Park area to reassure residents, a spokesperson for the unit said. The public should be reassured that this is an isolated incident. The people involved are known to each other, and there is no risk to other members of the public. Now, also arrested on suspicion of murder alongside George was a then 50-year-old woman named Christine Margaret Holloran. Known to both killer and victim, who admitted that she had witnessed the murder, and though she was quizzed until the afternoon of Tuesday the 4th of September, she was then released without charge. Gary George, meanwhile, had told police during questioning that he was a horror film fanatic and admitted that the killing was his attempt at a real-life reenactment of a scene from the 2009 Australian horror film The Loved Ones, which George said was one of, if not, his favourite in the genre, and that he'd seen several times. Being the intrepid researcher that I am, I watched this film as part of prepping this episode, and I can tell you that The Loved Ones follows a teenage boy who finds himself at the mercy of a classmate's absolutely bananas party when he is kidnapped by her and her father after he declines her offer to attend the school prom with her. It's a film that involves scenes of self-harm with a razor blade, someone's voice box and vocal cords being immobilized and destroyed with bleach, someone's feet pinned to the floor with knives, cannibalism, death by meat cleaver, car tire, the list goes on. Delightful sounding, I'm sure you'll agree. Personally, I don't think I'd ever bother to watch it again. Now, in one scene of the film, the antagonist brands her captive by carving her initials onto his chest and throwing salt on it, which was not lost on investigators. On Tuesday the 4th of September, Gary Anthony George appeared at Chester Magistrates Court after being charged with the murder of Andrew Mackenzie Nall on the 31st of August. George, who gave his address in court as Chester Aid to the Homeless's Crispin House in the city's Nicholas Street, also faced charges of causing grievous bodily harm with intent following an incident in a subway near the city's Fountains roundabout involving a man named Brian James Riley, shortly before 5 p.m. on the same day. Bail was not requested on behalf of George, and he was remanded in custody. When he appeared at Chester Crown Court just over 3 months later, on the 20th of December 2012, this time to issue a plea, George, who appeared with a shaved head and wearing a grey top and jeans, pleaded not guilty to the charges against Brian Riley and not guilty to the murder of Andrew Mackenzie Nall. However, admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His legal counsel, Gordon Cole KC, told presiding Mr. Justice Roger Dutton, he accepts the unlawful act that led to the death of Mr. Nall. However, he says another was involved as well. The following day, Friday, December the 21st, wearing smart black trousers and a white top, Christine Margaret Holloran appeared before Chester Magistrates Court, also facing a charge of the murder of Andrew Mackenzie Nall. Holloran, who confirmed her address as being Manor Hotel in Liverpool's Edge Lane, spoke only to confirm her name and that she understood the charges she faced before being remanded in custody over the festive period. In February 2013, she appeared at Chester Crown Court via video link from HMP Style in Cheshire for a pre-trial plea hearing, where she issued a plea of not guilty ahead of a murder trial scheduled for the following month. So, what's happened here then? The whole somewhat tragic story revolves around that demon that can blight anybody: alcoholism, also known as alcohol addiction, alcohol misuse, or alcohol dependence. The term used to describe the most serious form of high-risk drinking, with a strong, often uncontrollable desire to drink at a level that causes serious harm to your health. Though medically it's recognized as a type of alcohol use disorder, which can be treated by either detoxification, cognitive behavioral therapy, self-help groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous, and pharmacological treatments, or a combination of some or all of these, it's a problem that has an increasing mortality rate. Data released this year from the Office for National Statistics shows that in 2023, there were 10,473 deaths, that's 15.9 per 100,000 people, from alcohol-specific causes registered in the UK. Shockingly, the highest number on record. The number recorded in 2023 was 4% higher than of the previous year, where there were 10,048 deaths, 16.6 per 100,000, and 38% higher than in 2019, the last pre-coronavirus pandemic year, where there were 7,565 deaths, 11.8 per 100,000. Now, it shouldn't be a stigma to have this, for it is a disease that through whatever circumstances you may be faced with can happen to anyone, and chances are you may either know someone affected or have at least seen someone who is, or perhaps have had or are having your own struggles with it. I don't mind sharing that some years ago now, a long time ago now, for one reason or another, it was a road that I started down myself, though I recognise this and took full advantage of the help that is available, and which I must stress, it really is out there. Never ever think that you're alone. At one time in his life, lifelong Rangers FC supporter Andrew Nall had served in the army, and following his discharge had settled in the Chester area, where he had found work in a supermarket and then for Northgate Street greengrocer Francis Thomas. At some point in his life, it isn't specifically referred to what the cause was, though it was reported that he had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder relating to his time in the army and had also been psychiatrically assessed. Andrew had begun drinking heavily. He had the support of his family back up in Scotland, retaining a close relationship with his mother and sister, and had been in a long-term relationship with a woman named Maria Griffin, enjoying long periods of sobriety through this relationship, though ultimately his struggles with alcohol were something he could not completely shake. Though not homeless himself, he would often spend his days drinking with other alcoholics on the streets of Chester, converging where they have for many years around the subways leading to the city's fountains roundabout. And as a result, he'd come to know several of them well, including Christine Holloran and Gary George, both of whom were homeless. Andrew's relationship with Maria had come to an end by June of 2012. She had reportedly moved away to London and secured a good job as a lawyer, in Andrew's words. And it was following this that he increasingly came to police attention. He was already in regular contact with the probation and support services, stemming from his tendency to make hoax calls to police when drunk, something his former partner Maria told police later that was merely to seek attention. He had made 30 such hoax calls from May 2006 to June 2012, including once when Andrew had called police to say that his partner was dead, only for officers to arrive at the flat where they found him heavily intoxicated and Miss Griffin fast asleep in bed. His conviction for this, for which he was made subject to supervision orders and had to undergo alcohol treatment programs, had brought him to the attention of the probation services at Jupiter House. And the officer assigned to him, Karen Howell, began dealing with Andrew in May 2010 and met with him on numerous occasions. She got to know her client well, as when he had initially attended Alcoholics Anonymous sessions, he would talk at length to her about his mother and sister, but told later how she saw him deteriorate over time. Incidentally, Karen Howell was also the probation officer for Gary George too, although she'd never met George as he had not attended any of his scheduled appointments and she had had to report him for court breaches. But she was aware that he too was an alcoholic and that the two men were friends. David Howells, a substance misuse worker who worked out of Aqua House in Bourton, supported both George and Andrew Nall, and later recounted how George drank excessive amounts, and he regarded him as a potential risk to his own safety because he could become confrontational when drunk. He recalled to the court the following year. He said, "To the best of my knowledge, that it would be much easier if I went to prison, but I won't get long enough," was what I remember him saying. By contrast, Mr. Howells found Andrew to be calm and never once felt threatened by him. He described him as lost in his addiction and trying to break the cycle, but added, for some reason, he just couldn't get to where he wanted to be. Karen Howell told Chester Crown Court the following year that at an appointment in June 2012, Andrew told her that he'd split from his partner, alleging that she had attacked him, and going on to say that she was worried about the people he was associating with following this due to his loneliness and alcohol dependency. Miss Howells had become aware that a friend of Andrew's from Belfast and a woman called Chrissy were both living at his flat, whom she regarded as a negative influence on his lifestyle, and told him so. However, he had replied to her that he felt sorry for his friends and liked to be around people. Now, Christine Holloran was certainly living full-time with Andrew at the time of his death, and although it can't be ascertained as to whether anyone else was, I get the impression from this comment of Andrew's about feeling sorry for his friends that his flat was a bit of a haven for all sorts to get their head down at for a day or two. Gary George was certainly one. What can be ascertained more is that in the months leading up to August 2012, when Christine Holloran was living there, police were called to the flat on several occasions following complaints from neighbours reporting noise and on occasions violent disturbances too. A University of Chester student who lived nearby in Ashlawn Court, Eve Naggs, later told police about an argument she'd witnessed at about 3 p.m, 7 to 10 days before Andrew's body was found, describing a scruffy woman aged in her 40s or 50s, screaming at a man that she later identified as Andrew Nall before hitting him. He was sat on the ground. She ran over and he put his hands over his head. Obviously, he knew what was coming, said Miss Naggs. Now, more than one person was to claim that the relationship between Andrew and Christine Holloran was an abusive one, though Christine Holloran herself was to describe them as being very much in love and even planning to get married. Liam Smith, a recovering alcoholic and heroin addict who was living at the Rudy House homeless shelter in Chester at the time of the murder, described Scottish Andy, as he knew him, as a pleasant and quiet man who he would drink with on the street on a regular basis, including at about 10 a.m. on the day he died, when he had also met Christine Holloran, who he referred to as Christine or Mother. When asked if Andrew had ever talked about her, Mr. Smith replied, he said once she's had a drink, she became aggressive towards him and became difficult and violent towards him. Mr. Smith said he had seen a couple of bruises on Andrew's face and ribs, which Andrew said were caused by the aggressive behaviour of Holloran, although he said he didn't know whether that was true or not. David Howells recalled Andrew turning up at one session at Aqua House with a black eye just 10 days before his body was found, though claiming he had suffered the injury during an attack in town, as Andrew put it. David furthered. He mentioned there was a female staying at the property, and also that he didn't really want her to be there, as the other person used to drink a lot and wasn't helping him in his quest to become alcohol-free. On August the 28th, Andrew had turned up at the probation service for an unscheduled appointment with Karen Howell, saying he had been assaulted and, without identifying his attacker, claimed she would probably know the person. 2 days later, the last time she saw Andrew, he had attended Jupiter House for an appointment looking unshaven, red-faced and smelling of alcohol, and was with Christine Holloran, who Miss Howell saw having what seemed to be an argument with Andrew in the car park. She was in his face, she was quite irate and really angry about something, she said later. The probation officer added that Andrew had told her that Holloran was all right, just a bit of a nuisance, and that he had given her a key to his flat only a couple of nights before. Now, this strained-sounding relationship came to a head in dramatic fashion that same day. Niall had been with Holloran that day, and after they'd been drinking in the morning at the Fountains underpass, he had withdrawn £100 from his bank account. They got in a taxi together at about 1:45 p.m. to go to Jupiter House, and the driver was later to recall that Holloran was abusing Andrew throughout the journey, claiming that he had done something to her that she would not forgive him for. This is ostensibly the row witnessed by Karen Howell. Later that day, at about 6:30 p.m, Andrew and Gary George bought wine from the Tesco Express store in Delamere Street and cider and sherry from McCall's newsagents on Brook Lane. It seemed the pair then went to Andrew's flat to drink this, where they were later joined by Holloran. Together with George, Holloran then went to Bargain Booze on Mill Lane in Upton at about 9:30 p.m. that night to buy more sherry and cider. A shop assistant there named Rachel Reeves, I hope she's better with money than her namesake, recalled later. He asked for a bottle of sherry, and he then turned round and told me that the woman he was with had been raped. He said that it was okay though, I'm going to get him back. She was just standing there calmly when he said it. He said it a further 3 or 4 times. I'm going to get him back. I'm going to get him back. He mentioned the man who had done it had been living with the woman and had taken advantage of her. They then left together. They seemed quite friendly towards each other. That was the last night of Andrew Niall's life, for he was soon to die in the horrific manner that I have described. On the morning of August the 31st, Mr. Niall's neighbour noticed something unusual on his doorstep and took a photograph of a knife, a pair of scissors, and bizarrely, a tie that had been cut into pieces, a photograph which was shown to the court the following year. At about 7:50 that morning, Holloran and George went to Morrison's supermarket on Liverpool Road and bought some cider, believed to have been paid for with money taken from Andrew Niall's wallet, and by 10 a.m, Gary George had gone once again to McCall's in Brook Lane for yet more alcohol. Joanne Price, who had been working at the newsagent that morning, told later that she'd noticed George, who she knew as a regular customer, trying to steal a bottle of sherry from the store by placing it under his coat. Mrs. Price said, "We knew him as Mansion House Man, as he would come in at 8 a.m. nearly every day and buy a bottle of Mansion House sherry. He always smelled of drink. I'd seen him put the sherry under his coat and then attempt to walk out without paying. I went over to speak with him and told him to put it back. He told me to leave him be and leave him alone. I told him that I couldn't do that and that he had to put the sherry back, otherwise I would have to call the police. He said, 'Call the police if you like. They're after me anyway. I've just murdered my best mate. I'm going away for a long time.' He was choked and was crying when he was talking to me." Mrs. Price, who felt sorry for George because he was crying, told him that she and her fellow shop assistant would pay for the sherry if they had the money, and then recalled how George changed his story, saying, "I've just seen my best mate be murdered." He then gave me the sherry back, and then he left the shop. Mrs. Price also told jurors that George had an amount of dry blood on the top of his hand and appeared to have wet himself. It wasn't until she noticed a photograph of George several days later in a newspaper article that she gave her statement to police, saying that she'd not taken the matter seriously at the time. George and Holloran were in the city centre again at about 4 p.m. that day, where they met up with another acquaintance of theirs of no fixed abode, 53-year-old Brian James Riley, who later claimed that Holloran was his girlfriend. Riley said later that he was going to buy Holloran a can of beer from an off-license in Brook Street because she was feeling rough. There had been some sort of argument between Riley and George, as George had said he was going to smash his head against the shop window. Riley said that he and Holloran were walking away when George suddenly reappeared seconds later and attacked Riley on the nearby subway steps by the pharmacy in Upper Northgate Street. Mr. Riley recalled later. All of a sudden, he came from the middle of nowhere. He must have been following us. He said, "I'm going to kill you." He smashed the bottle on the step and attacked me with a broken bottle. George had smashed the bottle from which he'd been swigging and lashed at Mr. Riley with the sharp, broken remains, causing serious, though not life-threatening, injuries to his hands and wrists, and also striking him on the head with the smashed bottle. CCTV footage later showed Mr. Riley dripping pools of blood from his wounds onto the pavement outside the Bull and Stirrup pub on Upper Northgate Street before he was tended to by a pharmacist who came out to assist and call an ambulance. Holloran stayed with Mr. Riley while he was being tended to, but after a few minutes wandered off in the general direction of Eversley Park, where by then Andrew Nall's body still lay undiscovered. Mr. Riley had at first claimed to police who attended that he had fallen onto a broken bottle, but reluctantly, when they didn't believe this, soon told police that Gary George was his attacker. Officers tracked him down less than an hour later outside the Crispin House homeless night shelter by the headquarters building, which had been run by Chester Aid to the Homeless, and had arrested him on suspicion of grievous bodily harm. Just 3 hours later, after George had admitted in his subsequent police interview murdering Andrew Nall, Flat 4 of Eversley Park was being sealed off as a murder scene. The trial of Christine Margaret Holloran and Gary Anthony George for the murder of Andrew Mackenzie Nall began at Chester Crown Court in March 2013 before presiding Judge Elgin Edwards, the Recorder of Chester, where the pair denied killing 53-year-old Andrew as part of a joint enterprise, and George also denied causing grievous bodily harm with intent to Brian James Riley. In his opening statement, Ian Unsworth KC, prosecuting, said, "One night last summer, a 53-year-old man called Andrew Mackenzie Nall was subjected to a brutal, ruthless and sadistic attack in his own home here in Chester. He was beaten, kicked and stabbed on dozens and dozens of occasions. A strange long wound was carved into his abdomen. Salt was found on his wounded body. He was tortured. He was murdered. He was lying on his bedroom floor, his genitals partly exposed, his body surrounded by a pool of blood." The jury was told that George, of no fixed abode, was known to both Mr. Nall and Holloran. Continued Mr. Unsworth. He was homeless, openly gay, a heavy drinker, and, say the prosecution, had a keen interest in witchcraft. George, the prosecutor said, was fascinated by spells and had once wrote strange symbols on the wall of a house, apparently transfixed by the practice of doing so. Mr. Unsworth added, he also watched horror films. One film in particular that he liked to watch was called The Loved Ones, a violent horror film. In a chilling precursor to what befell Andrew Nall, one scene depicts a man being stabbed on multiple occasions, his chest having a letter carved into it before salt was thrown onto the wound. He continued, "This was not a burglary that went wrong. There is no mystique around who was present at the time of the attack. Christine Holloran was there, Gary George was there. With Andrew Nall dead, they simply left him and went to the supermarket together. They spent money in the supermarket together, money which was almost certainly Mr. Nall's. Mr. Unsworth told the court that George was also accused of attacking Brian Riley about 10 hours later in Chester City Centre. Gary George, say the prosecution, smashed a bottle, then used it to attack Mr. Riley. That too, as you will see, was an extremely violent attack. Officers only uncovered Nall's body when George was arrested the night after the murder for the attack on Brian Riley, as he was all too ready to admit what he'd done. Mr. Unsworth added, Mr. George asked the arresting officers if they'd ever seen the film Fright Fest. He said, "It was like Fright Fest last night." The jury was then shown camcorder footage made by crime scene investigators in the flat of Andrew Nall of the murder victim's mutilated body shortly after watching a clip from the loved ones to draw out the supposed similarities. Relatives of Andrew left the public gallery when the footage was shown, although a group of students remained to watch the video in the tense atmosphere. George himself watched intently from the dock as the camcorder film was shown on screens around the courtroom, but his co-defendant, Christine Holloran, could not watch and sobbed throughout. Now at this point, Gordon Cole KC was granted the court's permission to clarify matters for the jury, saying, "We accept the unlawful killing of Mr. Nall. The issue that we invite the jury to consider is whether or not Mr. George was acting out of diminished responsibility or acted as a result of loss of control, which means in due course we will be inviting the jury to say that it was manslaughter and not murder." However, Prosecutor Ian Unsworth said, "No, the prosecution take the view that it would be unacceptable to accept a plea to manslaughter. We would suggest it's murder." Judge Edwards confirmed such a plea as offered by the defence was unacceptable to the Crown. The trial then heard the story as I've brought you here from the accounts of witnesses that I've mentioned, and also the criminal past of both defendants and threats that George had previously made, evidence that was presented to jurors to show a propensity for violence of the two accused whilst drunk. In July 2008, George had told Harold Tomlin's Centre support worker Jacqueline Higgins that he was going to kill another man, Stephen McCarthy. Mr. Unsworth said, "He had said he was going to kill Stephen McCarthy, accusing him of spiking a friend's drugs. He said he knew what would happen to him, but killing him would be worth it." The level of threat perturbed Jacqueline Higgins to the extent that she contacted the police. Mr. Unsworth also told jurors that George, who had a string of offences for violent and drunken behaviour, had, in 1999, held a knife to a teenage female shop assistant and demanded money from the till. He entered a general store in Chester and approached the till. A teenage girl was working behind the till looking after the store. He grabbed her hair, pushed her head, and put a serrated knife against her neck. She struggled to get away from him and cut her finger on the blade. He then pushed the point of the blade against her neck and took £56.52 from the till before leaving. The court also heard that Holloran too had a string of offences relating to excessive drinking, including spitting a supermarket worker and punching a member of staff at another store in the chest. Brian Riley, describing his attack at the hands of George, told the court, "In my opinion, he had nothing to lose by killing me. Why he didn't finish the job, I don't know. Maybe he'd seen the blood." George Cole, defending, suggested Mr. Riley was homophobic and didn't like his client because he was an openly gay man. He asked, "You've known Gary George a long time. You don't get on with him, do you?" Mr. Riley admitted he didn't like George, but said he didn't care whether or not he was gay, saying, "My younger brother is gay. It doesn't bother me one bit. Gary George is not the most well-liked person in Chester." Becoming upset when Mr. Cole suggested that he was mistaken and George had not carried out the attack, Mr. Riley asked, "I dreamed this, did I? Someone jumped out of the canal, a frog or something, and did this." Simon Medland Casey, defending Holloran, said Mr. Riley's intention that day was to spend the night with Holloran, and he had asked her to go back with him to where he was staying in Ellesmere Port. "I'd just been slashed to bits, and I'm asking her to spend the night with me? Come on," replied Mr. Riley. Louise Hodgkinson, a friend of George, told the court she'd known him for more than 5 years and had shared his passion for witchcraft, saying, "He had an interest in witchcraft. You could say he had an obsession at times. He liked spells and stuff like that. He wrote strange symbols on my wall and took photographs of them when I was staying at Crispin House. He seemed happy when he was doing it." Mr. Unsworth suggested George had also been responsible for drawing similar symbols on the walls of the subway near City Road, which George denied. "I've seen some of the graffiti in the subway and it looks like the drawings that were on my wall, but I don't know whether it was Gary who had done them." Miss Hodgkinson told the court she'd seen George, who she said would drink up to 6 bottles of sherry a day, talking to Mr. Nall and drinking cider with him at about 5 p.m. on August the 30th, the last time Mr. Nall was seen alive. "I knew of Andy. I knew him as Scottish Andy. He was usually with Christine. I used to call her Cockney Christine. He wasn't with her that afternoon, and he'd been asking how Gary was. He went over to speak to him, and I saw them sharing a bottle of cider later on. He had said Christine wasn't living with him anymore, and that he was glad of a break." Miss Hodgkinson recalled seeing George again on the afternoon of August the 31st, wearing a green wax jacket that belonged to Mr. Nall, and describing him as being emotional and crying. "I was outside Crispin House and I saw Gary. He was wearing a green jacket and started to walk over towards me. When asked by Mr. Cole if she'd seen the jacket before, Louise replied, 'Yes, on Andy.' Miss Hodgkinson continued, 'He said he had killed someone, and I told him I didn't believe him. It was then that the police arrived and said they were arresting him for a Section 18, assault occasioning grievous bodily harm. He then said he'd killed a man to the 2 officers. I told him to shut up.' Mr. Unsworth then asked a tearful Miss Hodgkinson whether she was aware George had been a fan of the film The Loved Ones, to which she replied, 'From going around town, yeah, people said that he liked horror films. People said he liked the film The Loved Ones.' John Buchanan, education manager at the Harold Tomlin Centre in Chester, also told the court that George, who he said he first met about 7 years previously, would visit the day centre to watch films that had been downloaded as entertainment for centre users, amongst which, Mr. Unsworth said, were the horror movies Silent Hill and The Loved Ones. He asked Mr. Buchanan, 'You've seen Mr. George watching these films?' 'That is correct,' he replied. 'Had you seen him watching them on more than one occasion?' 'About 6 or 7 times, yes.' Mr. Cole then asked Mr. Buchanan whether he could be certain George had watched the horror films in question. Mr. Buchanan said, 'I would help set it up, but I wouldn't stand and watch the films. There was a spectrum of movies, from comedy to thriller. It was like a video shop in a sense.' Giving evidence himself, George told the jury how prior to the fatal incident, he had been on a cocktail of heroin, crack cocaine, diazepam, amphetamines, and 4 litres of sherry when he'd killed Andrew Mackenzie Nall. George told the court, When we were walking on Liverpool Road going to get more alcohol, she, meaning Halloran, said that he'd forced himself on her 2 days earlier. Those were the exact words. I was asking how she was and knew she was upset. It made me quite angry. When it was put to George that he'd told the shop assistant at Bargain Booze that Halloran had been raped and that he was going to get him back, George said, "I don't remember saying them things in the shop, but I must have been angry about what I'd just been told." On returning to the flat, the court heard from George how he had then fought with Andrew Nall in the living room after claiming Mr. Nall had gone to hit Christine, smashing a clay plant pot over his head before continuing to fight in the hallway leading to the bedroom. At this point, George said he punched him to the deck and accepted when suggested he then kicked and stamped on his face and chest. George then shut him behind the bedroom door, but Mr. Nall emerged with a small kitchen knife. I presumed he was going to try and stab me, so I attacked him again. He just looked angry in the face, said George. At this point, he again forced Mr. Nall to the ground and began kicking and stamping on him before finishing his attack in the bedroom where the victim was killed. I just couldn't stop myself. My head was gone. I just felt anger rushing through my body. Then I went and got 2 knives and stabbed him down the side. I stabbed him 6 times down the left side of his body and cut his ear. I went round the back of him and then cut his throat. I was absolutely out of the game. I was bladdered. When asked by Mr. Cole what was going through his mind when he began to fight with Mr. Nall and if he intended to hurt him, George replied, "No, it wasn't. I just wanted to get Christine out of there." When asked by Mr. Cole whether he had realised that Mr. Nall was fatally injured, George replied, "Unfortunately, yes." But under cross-examination, George denied torturing Andrew, claiming he couldn't remember cutting marks into Mr. Nall's body, nor rubbing cleaning cream into his eyes. Asked how the long carvings ended up on Andrew's chest and abdomen, he replied, "I don't know." Asked whether the victim was dead or alive when salt was thrown onto his wounds, he again replied, "I don't know." Prosecutor Mr. Unsworth also asked George about an interview with a doctor when he had apparently admitted offering Halloran the opportunity to partake in the attack and that she had stabbed the body with nail scissors. George denied saying this and played down her alleged role, saying, "Christine didn't have a clue what I was going to do." The court heard that Mr. Nall, during an incident at his home some months earlier, had told police officers that he was a member of the right-wing English Defence League. Whether or not he was is uncertain. He was said to have told them that he was opposed to homosexuality, something which George, who, as we said, is openly gay, claimed had never been an issue for the pair. George was also asked about his obsession with witchcraft and love of horror movies, given the injuries suffered by Andrew were consistent with this scene of the loved ones. Simon Medland KC, defending Halloran, said, "You had an obsession with witchcraft and tried to put spells on people." George replied, "No, I never. I'm not obsessed with witchcraft and never put spells on anybody. I have an interest in it and took a book out of the library once because we wanted something to read, but it got stolen." Mr. Medland said, "We've heard about the films you've watched in the Harold Tomlins Day Centre, in particular, The Loved Ones." George replied, "I thought it was a clever film and liked the way it was put together. I've seen it 3 or 4 times, yes." When Mr. Medland asked George whether a certain clip in the film where the heart shape with initials was cut into the victim and salt rubbed into the wounds was similar to the injuries suffered by Andrew Nall, George replied, "Yes, I suppose you could say that." When Halloran came to give evidence, the court heard that Halloran, who hailed from London, had in the past held jobs including deputy manager of a branch of fashion chain Bon Marche, a senior sales consultancy role, and a position within the post office. She said she had moved up to Cheshire after her parents had decided to move to Crewe in 1993, turning to drink after the death of her father, a man she gave up work to care for during illness in 1998. Holloran told the court she had been homeless in Chester since 2003 and had been sleeping in bushes and cubbyholes around the city during that time, saying, "I have places where I go that nobody knows about and where I feel safe. I used to drink to feel safe. It's hard being homeless. I needed a tipple in the morning to be able to get through the day." Holloran told jurors she and Mr. Nall had entered into a relationship in the months leading up to his death after he had invited her to stay at his house following a Salvation Army meeting. "We just got chatting and he invited me to come and stay at his house as I was sleeping rough. It was June when I started to stay there." Asked by Mr. Medland if she had slept with Mr. Nall when he invited her back, she replied, "No, I slept on the sofa for quite a while. About July time we started the relationship. It wasn't just a case of jumping straight into bed with each other. It was more like Mills and Boone. It was romantic. He used to call me pretty girl. I told him he should have gone to Specsavers. Andy and me were planning to get married. We hadn't made any firm plans, but we were looking to the future. Andy even wanted to take me to Glasgow to meet his mum. It was something we were looking forward to." Jurors heard how Holloran had known co-accused George for a few years, as she continued how George was interested in witchcraft and would put curses on people. "He thinks he's a witch," she said. "He liked spells and witchcraft, but I had no interest in it. He was obsessed with that film, The Loved Ones, and used to try to get me to watch it as they had a copy at the day centre. When Gary was talking about the film, he would get right into character and get really into it. He didn't like being interrupted." When asked by Mr. Medland whether she was a fan of horror movies, Holloran said, No, I don't like horror movies. No way." Holloran was asked if anybody, including George, had ever accused Andrew Mackenzie Nall of being a paedophile. She confirmed that she'd never heard such a claim against the man she called her boyfriend. Holloran told the jury that she'd been drinking with Andrew and George on the night of August the 30th, and Andrew had put on music and was dancing and was showing off a tattoo that he had on his bottom. There had been a ding-dong, as she claimed, at Mr. Nall's home in Chester on the night he was killed, but she left the flat when somebody shouted at her to leave. She claimed she came back later to find Mr. Nall lying on his back near the bedroom and George twisting a knife into his body, growling in a demonic voice as he stabbed Mr. Nall. Holloran had told detectives when interviewed, "What I saw was Andrew laying on the floor with his top off. Gary George was kneeling up against him, inserting a knife, twisted it, pulled it out, and done something like that with it. He was doing a ceremony thing." Now, she later clarified through motion that George had made an S shape above Mr. Nall's body with the blade, continuing, "I will never forget it for as long as I live. Gary was twisting the knife in him. He was like the devil. It was weird. After he released the knife, I went, 'What are you doing?' I panicked a bit. He said, 'It's too late. I've just killed him. Get rid of the body.' He sounded like the devil, and I think I came face to face with the devil himself. After, he gave me a bit of a whack as well." She said she then ran away from Mr. Nall's flat in a state of shock. Holloran said she was too scared to call the police after seeing Mr. Nall had been killed, but wished she had phoned them. In her mind, Andrew was just asleep, she said, but explained that in reality, she just couldn't accept what had happened to the man that she loved. Now, the prosecution challenged Holloran's claim that she didn't see all of the attack and that George was solely responsible, citing a blood spot that was found on her coat and the significant gaps in her memory from the 30th to the 31st of August, which she blamed on alcohol. Holloran said she couldn't remember going to bargain booze with George to buy more alcohol at about 9:30 p.m. that night, and denied telling George that she had been raped by Mr. Nall. She was unable to recall even where she'd slept on the night Mr. Nall was killed, or where she'd been in the hours after his death, although CCTV footage showed her hugging George in the street on August the 31st. She and George were captured on CCTV buying cider and wine from Morrison's at 7:50 a.m. the next morning, using money, the prosecution alleged, taken from Mr. Nall's wallet. Holloran said that she didn't even remember going to Morrison's that morning, and said the money could have been owed to her by Andrew. Asked by her barrister if she'd stolen the money, she replied, "Have I heck? I wouldn't do a thing like that." But she recalled pushing the wallet down into the deceased's pocket because it was hanging out, and Holloran's fingerprint was found on a betting slip that was inside it, a slip that was stained with Andrew's blood. Holloran had vague recollections of George kicking her in the head the morning after the stabbing, but she couldn't remember witnessing an attack on homeless man Brian Riley later on, saying she only recalled seeing the wounds afterwards. Holloran told the court emphatically, "I took no part whatsoever in the murder of Andrew Mackenzie Nall." Under cross-examination, Mr. Unsworth suggested Holloran had a selective memory. Citing CCTV footage, he asked her if she remembered hugging George and taking a drink from his bottle of sherry just hours after Mr. Nall's death. She countered, "Maybe I was scared. What's he going to do? Stab me? He might have stabbed me. He'd already put bleach into my eyeballs before. He was a hard nut. People referred to him as the gangster of Chester. Well, he thought he was the gangster of Chester anyway." Yes, reportedly about 5 months before the fatal incident, George had poured a bottle of bleach over Holloran's face while they were drinking on the Rose in the city centre after she had offended a friend of his, leaving Holloran relieved not to have lost her sight. Mr. Unsworth said her record showed she was quite capable of inflicting violence, and a witness had seen her slapping Mr. Nall just days before his death. Mr. Unsworth said Holloran had previous convictions for attacking men, and she agreed she had a propensity to attack men while drunk. He said, "You are a cold-hearted woman. You say you were upset by what had happened to Mr. Nall. When you were embracing the man you described as the devil, were you shedding a tear for Andy then? When you saw him twisting a knife in a demonic manner, did you shed a tear for Andy then?" Holloran replied, "I can't remember." Asked about George's claims that she had told him Mr. Nall had raped her, she responded, "Andy never raped me." Mr. Unsworth asked Holloran if she had regarded Mr. Nall as a meal ticket and suggested she had her eye on his flat, but she replied she would rather he was alive even if she was still living in the bushes. He then said to Holloran, "I put it to you that you are a liar and that you have selective memory when it comes to the killing and injury of Mr. Nall. You took part in that, didn't you?" Holloran replied, "No, I loved Andy. He meant the world to me. I would never do that." In his concluding remarks, Mr. Unsworth, who described Holloran as a cruel and callous woman, asked, "Did you use any implements upon him? Did you use scissors upon him? Did you encourage Gary George to behave in the violent and gratuitous way that he did? Did you help by cleaning up afterwards? Did you spend Andrew Nall's money? You did not love Andrew Nall, did you?" "I did," she replied. Now, George had changed his plea on March the 20th as the 3-week trial was drawing to a close, and now admitted murder and GBH, though Holloran maintained her innocence. Ahead of sentencing then, the court then heard testimony as to his mental state from several medical professionals. Jurors were told how George could have been suffering with a schizotypal disorder, characterized by mood changes and outbursts of anger in response to criticism. He had previously been assessed as experiencing florid psychosis, in which the sufferer loses touch with reality, when he would hear voices, have hallucinations in which he claimed to have seen demons, and believed things such as the sun and moon were talking to him, that others were trying to kill him, and that he himself would harm others. But consultant forensic psychiatrist Dr. Edward Silver told the court, "In my opinion, even if such a personality disorder were to be present, this would not be sufficient to support a finding of diminished responsibility in relation to this event." The jury also heard evidence from consultant forensic psychiatrist Dr. Rajan Nathan, who said it was difficult to assess what symptoms of psychosis had been present in George without the influence of drugs and alcohol at the time of the murder. Dr. Nathan explained that a history of drug and alcohol use in George's case may have affected his temper and control, and recalled how George had told him about how he had felt about the attack on Mr. Nall. "Mr. George told me, my head did go to a different place. I felt like I was possessed by a demon. I couldn't stop myself." Mr. Unsworth said that George had not been given any formal diagnosis of psychosis in prison assessments in previous years, and reminded the jury how shortly after his arrest, the following day after Mr. Nall's murder, George had been assessed by forensic nurse Veronica Mort, who herself told the court George did not claim to be hearing voices or having hallucinations. There were, she said, no such findings of a mental illness. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Lawrence Chesterman had met George on March the 4th of that year, ahead of his trial, and also told the court how George appeared to be functioning quite well. In his final submissions to jurors, Mr. Unsworth suggested that Holloran had been party to the murder and had no love for Mr. Nall, despite claiming that their romance was like something from the pages of a Mills and Boon novel. He said of Holloran, "Just before breakfast on Friday, August the 31st, 2 people walked out of the door of Flat 4, Eversley Park. They could have been any couple. They were far from that. What exactly happened behind that door is a secret that only those people know about. It was a secret that Christine Holloran knew when she was hugging murderer Gary George the day after. It was a secret that she knew when she was buying alcohol with his money the next morning. It was a secret that she knew when she told police officers who came to tell her that Mr. Nall was dead that he was just sleeping and to give him a tickle. A wicked thing to say." After deliberating for 9 hours and 57 minutes, shortly before 4 p.m. on Friday the 22nd of March, the jury of 8 women and 4 men cleared Christine Margaret Holloran of Andrew Nall's murder and an alternative charge of manslaughter after Judge Elgin Edwards had earlier told jurors he would accept a majority verdict. Holloran shouted out, "Justice" and "Thank you" after the verdict was read out at the end of the 3-week trial. Was that justice, do you think? Ahead of George's sentencing, in an emotional victim impact statement that was read to the court, Mr. Nall's sister Fiona Hall, who had travelled from the family's native Scotland to view proceedings, suggested that her sibling was vulnerable and said the family had been left reeling by his death. Her statement said her brother had struggled with alcohol for many years but was determined to turn his life around, adding, "Andrew was kind, considerate, and would help others without a second thought. He was an engaging conversationalist with a strong intellect and a quick wit. Those close to him are broken-hearted by their loss." Mrs. Hall said their 85-year-old mother was bereft at the loss of her only son, with whom she spent holidays both in Chester and the Highlands each year. The court had heard it was after Mr. Nall had split from his long-term partner Maria Griffin the previous summer that he went on a bender and down and outs began to appear at his flat, and Mrs. Hall said that Maria now found it hard to sleep and cope day to day since learning of the manner of Andrew's death, her only hope being that his suffering was not prolonged. She described him as generous to a fault, but naive in many ways. Despite struggling with alcoholism, Maria said Andrew had spent many months in sobriety each year, and those times were the best. She knew that he loved her and hoped he was at peace. She wrote, "Andrew would have celebrated his 55th birthday on Monday, March the 11th. He wasn't here to do so. Instead, a packed courtroom watched a shocking video showing his mutilated body lying in his own home, where he should have been safe. A wholly undignified end, indeed, to a life cut short at the hands of someone to whom he had extended a hand of kindness. I have lost my brother, who I loved deeply. Andrew's death has had a major impact on my life and that of my husband and daughter. The knowledge that Andrew sustained a brutal attack and the thought that he died terrified and in dreadful pain haunts us on a daily basis. Never did any of his family expect to have to deal with the aftermath of such a heinous crime. Andrew was the victim of this tragedy. However, it's a sad fact that the perpetrator of this crime took one life and ruined many more forever." Mr. Cole could offer little in mitigation for George, except by saying that George had a long history of alcoholism. Although no firm motive for the attack on Mr. Nall was ever established, Mr. Cole suggested, "Something was said to Mr. George which may well have been the catalyst, set against, of course, the enormous amount of alcohol which had been consumed." On March the 25th, 2013, passing the mandatory life sentence upon George, Judge Elgin Edwards, describing Andrew Nall, added, "He was vulnerable because of the amount of drink he had taken. You knew he had, you took advantage of it, and, putting it in a nutshell, he was no match for you. This was a cruel and vicious attack. It was also a sadistic attack. I am satisfied that in behaving in the way you did, you were aping the conduct in a film of which you were obsessed, namely The Loved Ones, and you enjoyed doing so. The jury and I had the misfortune to see the murder sequence in that particular film, and there it was quite clear the carving on the chest and the throwing of the salt over the wound was done when the victim in the film was alive. I regret to say I consider that in this scenario of the offence, you committed many acts while the unfortunate Mr. Nall was still alive, and that included doing something to his eyes with cleaner fluid and carving marks upon his chest, just as it happened in the film." Gary Anthony George was then told he would serve a minimum tariff of 30 years, and was also sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, concurrent to the life sentence, for the second attack which had followed 10 hours after the murder of Andrew Nall. Judge Edwards told George there was no guarantee he would ever be released, even after 30 years, if he was still considered a danger to the public. George, shaven-headed and wearing a navy blue jumper, stood bolt upright in the dock with his arms behind his back and showed no emotion as his sentence was passed, but simply nodded in acceptance of his fate. He acknowledged someone in the public gallery as he was taken down to the cells to begin this sentence. George is not eligible for release until 2043, by which time he will be 71 years old. In a statement released by Cheshire Police, Mr. Nall's family said, "Andrew was brutally murdered by a man whom he invited into his home. He would have had no idea that Gary George was a sadistic bully capable of the most extreme violence. The cruel and callous way in which Andrew died leaves us unable to feel anything other than utter contempt for his killer. He took the life of a kind and caring man, attempting to justify his actions by making untrue and wicked allegations that cast aspersions on his victim's character. The lengthy sentence imposed reflects the gravity of his crimes, which gives us some consolation. The trial has been a harrowing experience for everybody, especially those who loved Andrew. He is gone from our lives, but lives on in our hearts." Detective Sergeant Andrew Payne of Chester CID added, "This was a challenging investigation from the outset, as only Holleran and George know exactly what went on in the flat on the night Andrew Nall was killed. Through painstaking inquiries, we have pieced together the events leading up to Andrew's death and the later assault, which show that neither victim did anything to provoke the horrific attacks which followed. My sympathies go out in particular to the family of Andrew Nall, and I hope the verdict goes some way towards bringing closure for them." Christine Holleran did escape a prison sentence here, but she continued to be in trouble with police through drink-related incidents. By the following year, she'd collected her 34th conviction for some 57 offences committed throughout her life, including reportedly a 15-month prison sentence in 2007 after pleading guilty to GBH after glassing someone in Crewe in November 2006, a man named Richard Harthorne who lost the sight in his left eye as a result. Now, incidentally, the report gives the name Christine Holleran, but says formerly Christopher Holleran. Through researching, I couldn't ascertain for sure if it is one and the same person we're talking about here, though the locations, the court that was dealing, and the type of offence do tally with it being the same person. What are the chances of two? In 2014, Holleran received a 12-week prison sentence for breaching the terms of an ASBO made against her in 2011, and collected a separate 5-year criminal antisocial behaviour order, CRASBO, by Chester Magistrates Court the same year after a clearly drunk Holleran had entered a Northwich takeaway where she was then living, and upon hearing two members of staff in there speaking in Turkish behind the counter, Holleran had sworn at them and told them to speak English, repeatedly telling them to go back to your own country during the outburst, before unbuttoning her cardigan and showing a t-shirt which said police on it and said that she was the police before leaving the takeaway. Under the CRASBO conditions, Holleran must not act or incite others to act in an antisocial manner, threaten any person or property, or use or encourage others to use foul, abusive, insulting and offensive, threatening or intimidating language or behaviour in any public place. She must not be drunk in public, enter any exclusion zones listed, and must not contact or approach any named individuals. However, Holleran was arrested for breaching her ASBO for the 10th time within 2 days of being released from prison and received a suspended sentence for doing so. She was jailed for 10 weeks later the same year for again breaching, received another suspended sentence in March 2015 for the same thing, and another 8-week prison sentence suspended for 12 months for the same thing in February 2016 in Macclesfield, where she was last reported as living. Alcoholism is a terrible thing to get a grip on someone, and when combined with hard drug use also, it's a real disaster waiting to happen and can lead to not just destruction for the user, but also to terrible acts against another, such as we've heard described here. As we've also heard, it is a difficult crutch to let go of once it's become a way of life, and a sad cycle to be stuck into. Your days and nights spent revolving around drink, it being that one goal and surety of a day. I find it very sad and something I can see that very easily can happen to anyone dependent upon circumstance. It's a cycle that Christine Holleran found herself in for many years, making her a constant presence in the courts, collecting one alcohol-related conviction after another, and whether or not she is still collecting these, or whether she's gained the help and found the strength she needed to finally kick her demons into touch for good, isn't reported. For from 2016 onwards, all trace of reports about her stop. Gary George, meanwhile, I think was already beyond help, despite any addictions he may have had, and aside from any underlying mental illnesses, this sounds a disturbed individual indeed, and a nasty, dangerous piece of work, who you just get the feeling about that the only remorse he has isn't for Andrew Nall and his horrific death at George's hands at all, but for the loss of his own liberty and way of life. He certainly seems to have been obsessed with the loved ones. Have a look at it if you're curious. Personally, I'm not into the torture porn kind of things like that, and it's not one that I'd look at again. And whilst perhaps Andrew's murder may have begun as someone merely seeing red, aping such scenes from his favourite film in his crime soon took over. Desecration of Andrew's body in such a way cannot be for any other reason except his own gratification, can it? And if it hadn't been Andrew Nall, you just feel it would have been somebody else losing their life at his hands sooner rather than later. I mean, we've heard of his knife-point robbery, his attempt to blind Christine Holleran with bleach, and the attack on Brian Riley. A bit of a ticking on him, an individual capable of horrific violence, and one who quite rightly has a remaining 18 years on his sentence before any prospect of possible release on licence materialises. Should he of course live that long, and by which time he will be in his 70s. And if he was or is released on licence, then you would just hope he doesn't get his hands on any more video nasties to obsess over during that time, wouldn't you? That he may possibly try and ape the goriest bits from, especially after his homage to the loved ones. Not much else that can be said, really. I would welcome, as always, hearing your thoughts and feedback on the episode A Homage to the Loved Ones, which you can do so in the episode thread that's now up in the show's Facebook discussion group, or if you wish through any of the show's social media links. Please, as always, you're welcome to get in touch wherever you want to. With that, all that remains for me to say then is that I thank you for joining me in the MOG today, and that I still am, and hopefully still will be Paul, the true crime enthusiast, wishing you all good and safe times, and I shall speak to you very soon. Take care all, stay safe, and goodbye for now.